When the NBA instituted a draft lottery system in 1985, the idea behind it was to prevent teams from blatantly trying to lose games to be the worst team in the NBA to guarantee a top pick. Prior to that, the team that finished with the worst record in the league received the number 1 pick, the second worst record, the number 2 pick, and so on. And this is actually still the case for leagues like the NFL, Major League Baseball, who don't have a draft lottery. The lottery system, although not foolproof, would prevent teams from simply trying to lose as many games as possible, purposely resting their best players and basically creating a garbage product for the NBA and seeing bad basketball on a nightly basis, because even if you did finish with the worst record in the league, you were not guaranteed the number 1 pick. You weren't even guaranteed the number 2 pick. At that time, you could fall all the way to getting number 4 in the draft, even if you finished the season 0-82. And while this worked in preventing teams from all-out tanking to an extent, it didn't stop teams from coming up with unique ways to throw games. And while the NBA over the years has made further changes to the overall odds of the lottery, giving lower and lower odds to the worst teams in the NBA, spreading out the odds for the 14 teams missing the playoffs, tanking in the NBA has become even more prominent than ever before, with teams preferring to take a chance at landing a top pick for a shot at a franchise player rather than just remaining in the middle of the road competing for a first round exit in the playoffs. So how does the NBA fix this? Is it something that even can be fixed? Well, it's what we'll be talking about in this video. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this type of content, and in return, I'll be providing more NBA content like this. Now, recently, when the Dallas Mavericks, who were on the brink of elimination and missing the play-in with just 2 games remaining on their schedule, they made a calculated decision to rest all of their best players, including only playing Luka Doncic in the first quarter of the game, in which if they lost, they were out. Now, granted, the Mavericks at that time did not control their own destiny. They needed a loss from the Oklahoma City Thunder in order for them to even make the play-in, even if they had won those final 2 games. As such, the Mavs said, F it, we're calling it a season and waving the white flag. Why, you might ask? Why would a team that still has a shot at the postseason, even if it is the final play-in spot, choose to lose in front of their own hometown fans? Well, you see, the Mavericks actually don't have their first round pick. No, they traded that to the New York Knicks back in the Porzingis trade in a big package deal. Unless, of course, if the pick fell into the top 10, as the pick is top 10 protected. Sure enough, the Mavericks going into that game against the Bulls were tied with them for the 10th worst record in the NBA, meaning the Mavericks would have an 80% chance of keeping their pick if they remain in that 10 spot, versus if they had won, moving to the 11th best odds in the lottery, they would have only had an 8.5% chance of keeping their pick and shipping it off to the Knicks. And for a Mavericks team that doesn't have much draft capital as it is, keeping that pick, especially with the disaster of a season that they had, was paramount. Call it shameful, disrespectful, smart, calculated, genius, you can call it whatever you want. But the fact of the matter is, the NBA has a severe problem on their hands when it gets to the point where teams who have the ability to make it to the postseason with just 2 games remaining on their schedule prefer to lose so they can get a higher draft pick. That's never happened before, and I know some have said that's not true. Why are we singling out the Mavericks when teams like the Blazers started sitting Damian Lillard when they weren't officially eliminated from playoff contention yet, or even teams like the Jazz and Pacers did towards the end of their season? The biggest difference is the fact that those teams, by the time they started calling it a season, were well behind in the number of games to catch up to their opponent with a handful of weeks left in the year. And while yes, tanking has blatantly happened in the past, like the Sixers trusting the process or teams overtly tanking for guys like Zion Williamson, never have we seen a team who is down to the wire with 2 games left on the calendar, and in a game where if they lose, they're eliminated, chose to call it quits that late in the season. Go back and check. It's never happened in NBA history, not when a team still has hopes for the playoffs that late in the year. The Mavs also paid for this decision after the NBA launched an investigation into their decision to rest players at the end of the year, fining them $750,000, saying the Dallas Mavericks' decision to restrict key players from fully participating in an elimination game against the Bulls undermined the integrity of our sport. The Mavericks' actions failed our fans and our league. Harsh words from the NBA. But we all know a hefty fine of $750,000, which is nothing to a team in the grand scheme of their overall value and revenue that they generate, won't do anything to stop teams from continuing to tank. Let's face it, for some teams, you get to a point in the season where if things start looking bleak, it's more beneficial to lose to get an up-and-coming franchise player, potential anyway. Yes, the NBA draft is a bit of a crapshoot. Sometimes top picks don't pan out the way that you thought that they would, while later selections go on to be stars in the league. But you're more likely to hit on a superstar level player the higher the pick you have. A fine isn't going to stop teams from going with a tanking strategy. At the end of the day, if they land a top pick and get a future star with said pick, that player is going to more than make up for the cost of that fine. So what does the NBA need to do to prevent this problem from getting out of control? Well, first off, a fine is never going to cut it, especially when it's a fine as little as the one they handed down to the Mavericks. Unless the fine is in excess of, say, $10 million, teams aren't going to care. And even then, they might still find ways to covertly tank their season. Some have suggested just removal of draft picks, whether it be the current pick in question in a tanking season or future picks. Should it be first round picks, second round picks? Second round picks is usually the go-to for finding a team when they are found to be guilty of tampering in free agency, even though we all know every team in the NBA tampers on some level. Just depends on how well they do it and not getting caught. And even when they are caught and they lose a second round pick, it's usually worth it for whatever player they were able to bring in from tampering. I'm sure if you ask the New York Knicks if they care that they were stripped of a future second round pick to land Jalen Brunson, they would laugh and say, hell no. Brunson is more than worth losing a second round pick for. But like tampering, something that is widely recognized around the league and its fan base as a common practice when going into free agency, as long as you just keep it under the radar and avoid getting caught from the league, the same can be said about tanking. Even if there are fines or penalties associated with it, you can claim a player is just more injured than they actually are. You can intentionally give a player more or less minutes if you're the coach. You can intentionally draw up botch plays at the end of the game and claim it was just a poorly executed play. You can make it very hard to prove that your team was intentionally losing. Now, you could just remove their pick entirely if a team is found to be guilty of tanking, but that would likely lead to an uproar from team owners who will claim you can't make that determination and remove precious assets from something that is so subjective, which would lead to a rift and potential war between owners and the league. But what you can do is fundamentally change how the draft lottery is structured. As of right now, only teams that miss the playoffs are eligible for the lottery, meaning the ability to land in the top four as the lottery balls are drawn for those top four picks, with everything else falling after that in line based on a team's record. But what if teams that actually made the playoffs, even teams that finished with the best record in the NBA, had a very small, slim chance of getting a top pick? Unfair, yes, but so is a team wanting to be so bad and losing season after season just to get top picks, meaning unfair to the fan base and really NBA fans in general when they have to see a poor product of basketball when they're spending hundreds of dollars to attend games. Obviously, it would need to be structured in a way where it isn't simply an equal playing field across the entire NBA with every team having a 1 in 30 chance of getting a top pick, although that likely would solve the problem in tanking considering your record would have absolutely no bearing on draft positioning, only your playoff seeding. But by giving playoff teams even small odds of being included in the lottery, which further lessen the odds of those teams finishing with the worst records in the NBA, would disincentivize teams to just lose year after year to build through the draft, not when it's very possible that your pick might not be as high year after year. And while this would put some bad teams at a disadvantage in being able to build through the draft and just remaining in a perpetual state of losing, there are still ways to improve your roster by way of trades, free agency, and at the end of the day, we have seen countless times where draft picks that fall out of the top 5 end up becoming future superstars in the NBA. This would also eliminate the concept of being in basketball purgatory, known as the middle of the road, not good enough to truly contend, but not bad enough to get a high draft pick. By spreading the lottery odds across all teams, including those in the playoffs that even finish with seeds 7 through 10, would still have a shot at landing a top pick in the draft rather than just sitting in basketball hell year after year. Now, at the same time, I also acknowledge that there is never going to be a foolproof plan to stop tanking in the NBA. There will always, at some level, be tanking in the league. It's just a matter of how you go about equaling the playing field to disincentivize tanking, and more importantly, how you stop teams from blatantly throwing games in an elimination game. I would actually love to hear from you guys. What do you think would be the best way to eliminate tanking in the NBA? Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.